This is obviously the 15th Vanderbilt poll. One thing we want to stress is that this is again about registered voters in the state, not likely voters. We have over 1,000 people in the sample. And just let's start off with some time series. Again, this is hardly a surprise. Obama's approval has not changed very much, in fact, barely at all since May. Slight uptick from the prior year, but again, pretty steady. Again, given how red the state is, that's not a surprise. Trump, we wanted to obviously ask about President-elect Donald Trump, and again, given how well that he did in the state, these numbers actually mirror reasonably well how he performed in the actual election. 60% of Tennesseans approve of the president-elect, whereas 37% don't approve and the rest don't have an opinion. But that kind of approval is very, very strong and consistent with how well he did. And we'll be talking more in this poll about Trump and people's judgments about him and how it affects their views on policy, or at least shapes them. So here is the approval of Governor Haslam and of the state legislature. One thing that's important to note is that our governor now stands at 68% approval. He is a highly popular governor. His numbers did not go down. In fact, they obviously went up about 5 percentage points, so did the state legislatures. We'll talk a little bit about that theme in a second as we get dig deeper in the data, but I think this is one of the key takeaways, is that our governor remains popular, in fact, even more popular than at the last reading. Our senators are also doing better. Both Senator Corker and Senator Alexander, their popularity popped up quite a bit, from 48% in both cases to literally 60% in both cases. That's obviously good news for them as well, along with the governor. Here is a breakdown by party, which I think is important to note. One of the things that people would wonder about, and I suspect are surprised about in regards to Haslam's support, is that because of his stance on Donald Trump, that there might have been a penalty applied by Republicans, but that's just not the case. He remains as popular among Republicans as he ever has been. His support among the Tea Party remains strong. And obviously he's doing very well among independents and Democrats. And I think it's probably worth thinking a little bit about that we have a governor who's exceptionally popular, but the second part of that story, which is really critical, is that he's also a non-polarizing figure in this era of polarization. He's getting 57% of Democrats approving of his performance in office, 74% of independents, 71% of Republicans. This is really an impressive performance in the sense that we have this, we have the cover of Time magazine this week talking about Donald Trump, the president of the divided states of America, but yet here in our own state we have a governor who is not at all polarizing. In fact, it's impressive to see the kinds of approval he has across all party groups. And if you look at the senators and the state legislature, those patterns bear out. The state legislature is perceived as more partisan in the sense that the Democrats are the least favorable towards them. Only 36% approve, whereas 71% of Tea Party. Again, these numbers make some sense, but it's worth returning again to this point about the governor. Priorities over the state. We've had this time trend since we launched the poll in 2011, 2012. I think, and Josh will be talking about this in a second, you see a slight uptick in the importance of health care and a slight downtick in the importance of education from the May poll. And I think that there's a bunch of different possibilities that could explain that, and I think partly the election and the fact now that there's an opportunity to reform Obamacare in a serious way because the Republicans controlling the federal government, I think has given people more reason to be concerned about health care. There's also been the increase in the insurance premiums and lots of controversy surrounding that. And the economy ticked up as well, but again, the general pattern is the economy, of course, has become less important since we started the poll, but that reflects the easing of the Great Recession. Perceptions of the economy don't show much change. Again, the economy is doing reasonably well in the perceptions. The U.S. economy doing a little less well in the perceptions of Tennesseans than the state economy, and that's probably partly tied to partisanship. We have a president who's a Democrat. It may well change a little bit. We'll watch this over time. Once President Trump takes the oath of office, do people start to trend towards more belief that the national economy is doing well here in the state of Tennessee. We'll see if that's the case. Here is just a slice to show you, again, a kind of a Trump effect. Basically, the people who judge Trump favorably versus people who don't, they have very different perceptions of the economy. If you think the economy is doing well, you're much more likely to be unfavorable towards Trump. If in fact you think the economy is doing badly, you have a much more favorable view of Trump. And of course, part of Trump's success can be tied to the fact that people were unhappy with the condition of the economy, and that is reflected in these data. Here is just a broad question about whether people think President Trump will bring good change to government, or for the better or for the worse, and stay the same. And as you can see, there's overwhelming belief that he's going to bring change that's good for the country. And of course, that's among the reasons why he was elected. People wanted change. He was the change agent. Hillary Clinton was not the change agent. And you see these data very clear among that. We did do one breakdown. I think it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but I think only 1% of Republicans thought that the change would be for the worse. In other words, the Republicans are very much convinced that he will bring good change to the country. Obviously, Democrats have a slightly different view, but collectively the state does believe Trump will bring much needed change to Washington. Here's something that's I think is partly what's going on with some of the numbers in the approval rankings, where Senator Corker and Alexander, Governor Haslam, and the state legislature all improved. We also see a jump in optimism about both the state and of the country. And that surely reflects the fact that we have President-elect Trump rather than President-elect Hillary Clinton. People, especially in this state, Republicans, are more optimistic about the future because they believe there's a chance to, quote, drain the swamp, or whatever terms you want to use. And so this has led the state collectively to be more optimistic about the future. And so you now have 81% of the citizens of the state believing that there's a bright future for the state. And that's a big jump from 67% when we asked this question in May. And for the country, it's risen from 40% now to 59%. Both of those are really interesting stories, and talking about the fact that Trump has changed, at least here in the state, some people's view about the future. And here is optimism of the nation and the state by party. And this is interesting in the sense that if you take a look at Democrats in the state, 67% are optimistic about the state. Obviously, that's higher among Tea Party and the Republicans, but it's still pretty high among Democrats. And even if you go to the United States, there's still some optimism. It's not overwhelming, but it's 48% of Democrats in the state are optimistic about the direction of the country and the future of the country. That's encouraging news. When you think about the fact that we've had a very divisive election, and it still is divisive in a lot of ways. But here there's some still optimism among Democrats and obviously among independents as well. So that hopefully gives a little bit more of an optimistic tilt to interpreting what has been a very harsh election. And then I think this is the last slide before I turn it over to Josh. This is a question we've started to ask about anger. We know that the country is angry and they're frustrated. It's interesting to see that the national government numbers really haven't changed very much. There's a slight uptick, and I wouldn't want to read too much into it, in the proportion of Tennesseans that are content in November, but still at 14%. But there is a sizable change in attitudes about feelings towards the state government. The level of frustrations declined a little bit, and the level of increasing contentment, that's increased. And that's somewhat consistent, it's very consistent, in fact, with what you see with Governor Haslam's popularity, and also the state legislature's popularity. So that's kind of an overview of that. I'm going to turn it over now to Josh.
Well, thanks so much, John. So one thing that we always question is, what does the election actually mean, right? So we know that Trump won. Now the Republicans control the Senate and the House. So what does that mean about what voters are actually wanting? Is it representing a hard right shift in terms of policies, or is there something just signaling change? And so public opinion polls give us one chance to try to unpack exactly what that might mean. So one thing we did on this poll is we asked the country what they thought. We asked registered voters in Tennessee what they thought the top priorities were for President-elect Trump and Congress. And what we found is pretty interesting. So you think about the number one issue that voters want Trump and the Congress to handle, it's defending the country from terrorism. Right? This is an issue that Trump picked up very early in the campaign, and he kind of rode that all the way to the White House. The second one is kind of reducing health care, followed by reducing crime, right? An issue that didn't get a whole lot of talk in the election in general, but something that Trump had talked about, from time to time. So one thing that a narrative that's playing out is we see that Trump's staffing his staff is that there's not a whole lot of interest about reducing the role of special interests. Only 43% of the registered voters in Tennessee identify that as a top priority. And similarly, global trade issues, something that got a lot of talk about during the campaign, only 44% of registered Tennesseans identify that as a top issue. So if we think about some of the things that were talked about in terms of the campaign versus what the registered voters in Tennessee want, there's a little bit of a disparity there. Supporters want Trump and the Republican Congress to focus on health care, crime, strengthening the military, and reduce terrorism. And a lot of these economic issues are changing the culture of Washington. Those are secondary in large part to those core concerns about keeping the country safe and building the military. So consistent on that about what the election means and whether it represents a kind of a very strong desire for more conservative policies, if we look at the state policy, we don't see a whole lot of evidence of that at all. So an important issue that the state continues to confront is the question about financing and state transportation. And so we repeated a question that we asked a year ago in 2015 about support for the gas tax. And what we did is we took our 1,000 people and we gave them 3 different questions. Would you support a 2-cent gas tax, a 8-cent gas tax, or a 15-cent gas tax? And what you see that even if for a 15-cent increase in the gas tax, nearly 47%, half the registered voters in Tennessee would support that. A number that's, if anything, slightly higher, but not really distinguishable from 46% a year ago in November. And so across the board, right, there is support for increasing taxes on gasoline to help pay for infrastructure, whether that is 2 cents all the way up to 15 cents, right? A majority of registered voters indicate their support for that, a support that's constant and has been constant for an entire year now. Another question that's going to be confronting the country is what to do about the Affordable Care Act. And here again, we find a picture of relative stability about what the voters want. And so the biggest change is that only 21% following the election, same as in 2015, say that the Affordable Care Act should be repealed and not replaced. So there's no enthusiasm for just doing away with the Affordable Care Act. The critical question is, what does the replacement, to the extent there is a repeal, take shape? And so there's still a slight decrease, but still 16% of the public would want to move to a single-payer option. 28% want to build on the existing support, but the largest increase between this year and last year is that now nearly 30%, 29% favor a Republican alternative. Right? So there's a great deal of support among the public for building upon and replacing the system with some kind of Republican alternative. So this is going to be a very important part of the conversation going forward as Republicans in the House and Senate and President Trump try to figure out exactly what shape they intend to make our healthcare system in the future, because the voters are pretty divided on exactly what they want about that. So returning to an issue about what the election means and whether it reflects a conservative shift or not, again, our evidence shows that that's not necessarily the case. So in particular, views on same-sex marriage, if anything, are becoming ever so slightly more liberal in terms of the percentage who say that they strongly or somewhat oppose has dropped, right, from 54% in May to 45% in November in our current poll. So that's not to say that it's wildly popular, but the resistance and the opposition to that is something that's is slowly falling across time, and we don't see a strong uptick in kind of conservative positions when it comes to kind of same-sex marriage. Similarly, in terms of marijuana legalization, a question we've been asking since May of 2014, we see a very similar trend, right? No kind of evidence of a very strong shift towards, a conservative outcome, right? But instead, if anything, a slight liberal trend in terms of beliefs towards legalization, either towards medicinal use or personal use as well. And so again, the emphasis is that how we interpret the election, the victory of Trump in the national does not, at least among Tennesseans' mind, indicate a strong preference for very conservative or kind of more conservative policies than they expressed in the past. Another issue that got a lot of talk about in the election is about the nature of immigration, and so we asked about the status of legal immigration, and you can see overwhelmingly registered voters in Tennessee think that legal immigrants help the United States far more than they hurt the United States, 74%. So when we talk about legal immigration, there's very strong support, right, among registered voters in the state of Tennessee for the notion that legal immigrants are a boon or a benefit to our country and not so much a detriment. This is not something that differs by your support for President-elect Trump, right? So those who are favorable towards Trump, right, they're slightly less supportive than those who are unfavorable. Still, nearly 70% of those who are favorable of President-elect Trump have a favorable view towards legal immigrants and thinking that they help our country more than they hurt our country. And even among illegal immigrants, right? So another issue that kind of got a pretty prominent play in the election. Again, there's not a whole lot of change from what we've seen over time since we started asking this question in December 2012, right? The percentage of voters who think that they should be required to leave the United States, right, extricate themselves, is only 28%, right? A number that has been has declined from December 2012. Instead, most voters, right, think they should be allowed to stay and apply for citizenship or stay as temporary guest workers. So again, views towards illegal immigrants in the state of Tennessee, right, are not as simple as saying they should all be deported, right? It's a pretty stable view towards them in terms of what ought to happen next. And there's not a great change that is indicative or kind of would explain the election of President-elect Trump. Similarly, when it comes to the issue of handguns on campus and gun control that we asked about, and this is asking about whether or not we should allow college students aged 21 or older to carry handguns on college campuses with a valid concealed carry permit, there's not a huge overwhelming amount of support for this idea. Right? Only 55% of registered voters in Tennessee would support allowing kind of registered handgun carrying on college campuses for registered users. So again, it's an idea that sometimes gets talked about, but at least among registered voters in the state of Tennessee at this point, there's not a whole lot of support for allowing that on college campuses. Right? Only 42% think that's a good idea. 55% think that would not be, a very good idea. And so I think overall, the pattern of results that we have is that once you start digging it down, trying to figure out what does the election actually mean about the views that registered voters in Tennessee have about policy and going forward, both of the nation and the state, at least in the state, the voters are not a whole lot of change, right? Not a great dramatic change to the right, but instead it's kind of more of the same, right? If anything, slightly more progressive policies, but again, those differences are not terrifically great. So instead, the election of Trump, at least for registered voters and reading the poll, seems to be more about a desire for change or having him as a change agent rather than a reflection of deep-seated desires to move the country in a dramatically different direction as it relates to the particular policies and the different views of the voters themselves. So thank you all for taking the time, and John and I would be happy to answer any questions you have about this or anything else about the polls and the findings that we have.